My thanks to President Summers once again for a scintillating half hour. Larry, thank you. In fact, it was scintillating enough that we were running a bit behind, and we did so well last night. I hope we can make up for that a little bit today. And I trust that, Diana, you're not up against the deadline immediately, so we can go over 15 minutes. We are about 15 minutes behind. I'll try to be very brief because I want to turn immediately to introduce Diana Eck to you. This is, for me, not a very difficult thing to do in a lot of ways because Diana and I hesitate to say, of course, I'm sure we were only 5 years old. Only 5 years old at the time, but I think it's been about 37 years since we met for the first time here in the Center for World Religions when we were graduate students here. Don and I have worked together on many, many things, from undergraduate education in the college here to a lot of other projects. And I have followed with a great deal of admiration her work, which of course had begun really in Indian studies and still remains very well known for her work in Indian studies. And many of you probably know her book, Benares, City of Light, which is a wonderful text in many, many ways that I encourage you all to look at if you don't know it. But her work has evolved and has moved into the issues of religious pluralism in this country. And since 1991, with the Pluralism Project, which I expect all of you are aware of, she has been really a figure on the national scene in terms of raising the issue of religious pluralism in America and the growth of non-Christian, non-Jewish communities in the last century. And particularly in the last decades in American life, and now has some 60 affiliates and associates working in the Pluralism Project and studying this. I think she's continuing now with Ford Foundation funding and other funding to be strongly supported in this. And her book, her recent book, A New Religion, which I can never remember the full subtitle of, but I have it here, A New Religious America, the subtitle, How a Christian Century Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation, which was published in 2001 and has certainly seen a lot of attention in that period of time. Diana herself has been engaged not just in the academy, but also worked closely with churches, including United Methodist Church, her own, which is her own, and also the World Council of Churches, both in the U.S. and internationally, on questions of interreligious relations and dialogue. She received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton and the NEH in 1996, and has been honored since by Montana, her home state, with the Governor's Humanities Award in 2003, and by the Unitarian Universalist Association with the Melker Lifetime Achievement Award, also in 2003. A distinguished scholar and colleague. It's a great pleasure to have Diana here, and let me just turn it over to her so that we don't take any more of her time. Dee?
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. What a great pleasure to be here, to be with this distinguished group of HDS guests and alumni, and to talk about some of the things that matter most to me in the area of the swift currents and white waters of religion in America today. These are issues, religious pluralism, that have become increasingly central to my work, though in a sense, the country that I began studying, the religious traditions of India, really is one that has wrestled for the past century and certainly since the time of independence with these very issues of religious pluralism and increasing religious communalism. These are global issues, they're national issues, they are also increasingly local issues in the United States. They're civic issues that we face as citizens, learning how to live and indeed to flourish with our deepest differences, our religious differences, in a multi-religious world and a multi-religious neighborhood. They're also theological issues that test our understanding of other faiths and our own faith, no matter what faith that may be, in a religiously plural world. There could be no more important question than how all of us will learn to live together in greater proximity than ever before. And I've entitled our discussion today, Religious Pluralism, Civic and Theological Discourse, to enable us to think about these issues of religious difference in distinct, though related ways, in a civic key and a civic rhetoric, and also in a theological and religious key. But let's begin here at home with the United States and the fact that in the last 40 years, since the passage of the Immigration and Nationalities Act of 1965, immigrants have come to the United States from literally all over the world. And they have brought with them not only their economic aspirations and their political dreams of freedom, they've also brought with them their Bhagavad Gitas and their Qurans and their images of the Bodhisattva Guan Yin and of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And they have participated increasingly in the life of America. They have built religious institutions and in some cases religious infrastructure in this country. They have built mosques and Islamic centers and Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist temples, Sikh gurdwaras, Hispanic and Vietnamese churches, and they have given us a more complex religious landscape than ever before. And they have raised those issues of religious pluralism that are really the concomitants of freedom of religion in America in a new way, in a new key, both as they relate to our constitutional democracy and as they relate to our growing relationship with one another as people and as communities of faith. Some of these immigrants, to be sure, would describe themselves as thoroughly secular. Some have had quite enough of the dominance of religion and, in some cases, the oppression of religion in their home countries. And they're also relieved to be in a society that not only recognizes the freedom of religion, but the freedom not to be religious, should they so choose. These immigrants have made America's ethnic and racial composition more complex and varied, even as they have magnified the reality of our religious diversity. So to talk about that reality for just a moment, let me say the Pluralism Project has been documenting and interpreting this new religious America for over a decade now. I met Sue Skees last night again, who hadn't really seen since she was part of this research in the Bay Area in the early 90s. There are probably others of you who have participated as well. Trying to cast the light of study and attention on many communities that have scarcely been noticed in their cities and towns. Hindu temples that might be in a former convenience store in Sunnyvale, California, or in a church at the corner of Polk and Pine in Minneapolis, or a mosque that might be in a former U-Haul dealership in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or a gymnasium in Oklahoma City, or a bowling alley in Hartford, Connecticut. For the most part, you could drive right by these places and not know there was anything new there at all. One of my favorites was a Buddhist temple, a Vietnamese temple in Claremont, California, where I was sort of looking for the address, and I found it on the mailbox, and it didn't seem to look like a temple. It was just a regular home. The monks came out, lifted up the doors of the two-car garage, and there was this immense temple inside the two-car garage with all the Buddha altars. And on Sundays and on holy days and weekends, this driveway was filled with Vietnamese Buddhists. So this is the kind of landscape that has gradually caught up on us. And of course, as we know now, many immigrant communities, as in the past, have really attached an important symbolic value to creating the kind of landmarks that enunciate their presence. So increasingly, we have major Hindu temples in the outskirts of Boston, or in Atlanta, in Nashville, in Louisville, in all the major cities of the United States, really great, beautiful, architecturally prominent Hindu temples, as we also have mosques like the mosque in Toledo and rising from the cornfields outside next to the interstate on the edge of town, or the mosques of Chicago, or the zones in which mosques have been established all over the city of Houston. We have many forms of Vietnamese and Cambodian and Chinese, Taiwanese, Korean, Buddhist communities as well. And we have seen the striking domes of new Sikh gurdwaras built in cities and towns across America. In Fremont, California, the little street called Hillside Terrace was renamed Gurdwara Road. And when that went to the city council meeting, there was this enormous discussion, and one of the people raised his hand and said, "I can't even pronounce Gurdwara." And one of the Sikhs said, "Well, I can't really even pronounce Paseo del Padre." And that really is the reality of America. We are struggling to pronounce one another's names, much less to incorporate and engage with one another's realities. So all of these new projects, you might say, have added a cumulative complexity to America's religious landscape, and documenting their presence has in part been the work of the Pluralism Project and its affiliates across the country. We believe that when the first Hindu temple is built in the state of Delaware, that actually is an important moment in the history of Delaware, as well as an important moment in the history of Hinduism. And somebody should be paying attention, as one of our undergraduate researchers was about 4 years ago. Or when the Islamic Society of the East Bay and St. Paul's United Methodist Church buy property together in Fremont, California, and negotiate a set of easements and establish a frontage road called Peace Terrace and get out their bulldozers and start digging for a mosque and a Methodist church to be built side by side, that is an interesting subject of academic research, a longitudinal one, in this case that began 10 years ago and is still going on. So the Pluralism Project has been trying to pay attention to these things. But as you know, the sheer fact of our diversity and pluralism are not synonyms. Pluralism isn't just the recognition of diversity. It is a response to diversity, an engagement with it in one way or another. And it's not the only response to diversity. There are other kinds of responses to diversity, and we have seen them in the current time and throughout American history as well. Exclusion, for example, is another response. And indeed, exclusion was the intent and purpose of the exclusion of Asian immigration from the United States, beginning in 1882 and continuing decade after decade after decade until 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act, when basically immigration was cut off. And we know that those exclusivist attitudes are not over. We can see them in books called Alien Nation, or Pat Buchanan's book called The Death of the West, or even in Sam Huntington's recent book with that great title, but not so great inside the covers, called Who Are We?, that asks the question of the we of the United States of America. And we know there are exclusionist attitudes even today. The word leave written across the altar of a Hindu temple that was desecrated in Pittsburgh, for example, a real exclusionist message. Or after 9/11, the Muslim Girl Scouts in Charlotte, North Carolina, started to have a few questions about where their origins were or their loyalties. And one of the little kids at school came up to Sumaya and said, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" When she showed up with her scarf on, she said, "Well, I came from Connecticut." And that actually is the reality of where we came from. But the idea to go back to where you came from, we recognize it in our public discourse even today and in increased anti-immigration voices. But inclusion or assimilation is also another response to diversity, wanting the religious or cultural other to somehow be included under the umbrella of one's own world, in one's own terms, in one's own language, in the structures already made and made by us. There is something generous about inclusion, and I don't want to denigrate it too much, but when there's a large majority religious community with a strong normative consciousness, the dangers of a kind of inclusive consciousness often include the eclipse of the religious or cultural other, and certainly the eclipse of effective agency for the other. And this has both civic and theological registers. But when you think of it in the United States with this large normative, quote, Christian majority, over 85% Christian, that becomes a kind of consciousness that often doesn't register the presence of the other. Similarly, I was in Indonesia this summer with a large Muslim majority normative consciousness, over 85% Muslim. One could say the same thing in India, over 85% Hindu. How does that kind of majoritarian consciousness begin to register voices that are not its own? Not simply to include them on its own terms, but literally to listen to them, to engage with them. And pluralism is about that kind of engagement, not about erasing or melting away our differences, but about the integrity and the encounter of difference, not the shedding of distinctive cultural or religious or political differences, but the effort to create a society in and out of these differences, not about relativizing deeply held religious convictions, but in and through these convictions, developing relationships of trust rather than enmity. And pluralism is the glue that will enable a society that is a diverse, multi-religious society to hold together if it can work. And our challenge in the United States and in many multi-religious societies today is, can it work? And so the analysis of the progress of pluralism goes far beyond, in our case, with the Pluralism Project, just the documentation of what's going on in the United States, but really looking carefully in several spheres to try to see how pluralism is effectively working. Do we have some best examples, best practices of the ways in which America is or is not becoming a pluralist society, both on the civic register and on the religious register, both in the language of citizenship and in the language of theology and religious encounter? And two of the initiatives of the Pluralism Project now are respectively the City Hall initiative, where we're looking at civic issues, and the Interfaith Initiative, where we're looking at the ways in which people, quite apart from being co-citizens, are seeking each other out to develop those kinds of bridges of understanding as religious people. And the new religious diversity of America has revealed in many ways the kind of presumptive, normative, long unmarked elements in the relation of religion and public life. And that is all the way from big national issues like the focus on the Air Force Academy this summer and its pervasive evangelical Christian atmosphere that was not only part of the chaplaincies but also part of the chain of command. That suddenly became an issue that captured national attention. And that goes right down to the multitude of stories you'll never read about in the New York Times, like the episode when the Minnesota legislator protested the Dalai Lama's presence in addressing the Minnesota state legislature because, quote, Buddhism is inconsistent with Christian principles, a point that is perhaps deserving of Buddhist-Christian dialogue, but one that has little to do with the civic context in which the address took place. Another example of the need to distinguish these forms of rhetoric. In the fall of '99, the Southern Baptist Convention published a prayer guide about this time of year to enable Christians, Baptists mainly, to pray for Hindus during their fall festival of lights called Diwali. It spoke of the 900 million Hindus who are, quote, lost in the hopeless darkness of Hinduism and who worship gods which are not God. Well, Hindus do not consider themselves to worship not God, and many of them were really incensed by this. They picketed Southern Baptist in Houston. They demanded but did not get airtime from Pat Robertson. They didn't so much mind being prayed for, but they deeply minded the fact that they felt their faith had been misrepresented, misunderstood, and demeaned. It was hurtful, and it made them angry. Several of them were so incensed that they protested to Janet Reno and the Department of Justice. Gradually, they came to realize that it's not against the law for Southern Baptists to believe that they're going to hell. To Hindus, it was religious slander. To Southern Baptists, it was their religious belief. And the Hindu-Christian theological discussion, as much as it has been forwarded by the likes of Frank Clooney and myself and others who have been engaged in this, has not really reached to include our Southern Baptist brothers and sisters, though it should. But the question of who has seen the light of mercy and God's presence more clearly really must be referred to that interreligious encounter, to that theological encounter, the Department of Justice can be no help. No matter what Baptists may think of Hindu gods or what Hindus may think of Baptist bigotry, both are co-citizens in a state that should ideally treat them equally. But another episode, in the fall of 2000, a Hindu was invited for the first time in American history to offer the invocation in the United States Congress, in a joint session of Congress when the Indian Prime Minister was visiting. The priest was from the Shiva Vishnu temple in the outskirts of Cleveland, and a Christian group vociferously protested. The Family Research Council issued the alarm and called the Hindu invocation a move toward ethical chaos, and said it was one more indication that our nation is drifting from its Judeo-Christian roots. The next day, however, the group issued a clarification. Quote, "We affirm the truth of Christianity, but it is not our position that America's Constitution forbids representatives of other religions than Christianity from praying before Congress." And this time they had to think, and they got it right about that. But these two instances, Hindus and Christians both encounter the distinction between their civic and theological views. No matter how we think about and evaluate religions different from our own, no matter how we think about religion as a whole, even if we're atheists or wholehearted secularists, the covenants of citizenship to which we adhere place us on common ground. As Thomas Jefferson put it, the legitimate powers of government extend only to such acts as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So what do we mean when we use this wonderful, powerful two-letter word, we? We use it in many ways. We have civic we's, the we's of citizenship. We have theological and religious we's, the we's that link us to the community of faith to which we belong if we do belong to a community of faith. And distinguishing between the social and rhetorical contexts of our theological and civic language, between the spheres in which we engage questions of concern, either as citizens or as people of faith, is absolutely essential. It's not that religious discourse is private, whereas civic discourse is public. Rather, both religious and civic speech certainly can be very public, but they are different. They're directed to different audiences. They employ different rhetoric of persuasion. They are substantiated with different, quote, footnotes, if you will, and appeals to authority. And both are preeminently concerned with ethics, and both require engagement across the tensions of religious difference. But the we an American president speaks inside St. John's Episcopal Church across the park from the White House cannot be the same we he brings to the public arena when he addresses the nation. For when he addresses all of us as president, he is president of all the people, even the people who disagree with him, even the people who are not of his religious views, the people who didn't vote for him, and those who may not be religious at all. So how are we doing on this we question? I'm going to spend the rest of my time on that, mostly civic and some theological. Let me mention 5 ways in which we seem to be grappling with the we in the civic sphere in the United States. The first one is going to court. Of course, this is as American as apple pie, you might say. One of the great ways of being an American. And we have seen in the last summer or so several instances in which our we's have been engaged in a new way. In the Pledge of Allegiance case, for example, an amicus brief was filed with the help of the Pluralism Project database by dozens and dozens of American Buddhist temples and communities who said they should not be forced to choose between their country and their religion. They should not be made to feel like outsiders to the American project, either by saying the pledge they don't believe in or remaining silent. And in asking Buddhist school children, they said, to recite the pledge, quote, they are asked to articulate a religious concept irreconcilable with the teaching of their religion and the supreme wisdom, the awakening that is their goal. Now, the Pluralism Project is interested in this not because of an agreement one way or another, but because it marks a moment when American Buddhists have stepped forward to register a voice on one of these important issues. And a similar moment happened last year when the Ten Commandments cases went forward to the Supreme Court. And in the Texas case, Van Orden versus Perry, there was an amicus brief filed by the Hindu American Foundation on behalf of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist groups. It notes that the Fifth Circuit, in upholding the constitutionality of that big Ten Commandments monument outside the Texas State House, had argued that no one had contested its presence for 40 years. But the Hindus pointed out the clear fact that America has changed in precisely these 40 years, and the reality of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist presence in Texas. Quote, the setting of the monument inherently, inescapably signals to the religious minority of those practicing non-Judeo-Christian religions, often recent immigrants, that they are not merely religious outsiders, but unwelcome strangers to the political community as well. So that's one example of a new weighing in. A second example, participating in public life. One of the things that we did in the Pluralism Project a year ago was to begin through the spring and summer of 2004 actually documenting and tracking the widespread participation of new religious communities in the electoral process. Things like the American Muslim Task Force on Civil Rights and Elections that was formed to coordinate the work of many national Muslim organizations, to hold town hall meetings across the country, to think about the issues from their standpoint. There were Muslims elected via the caucus system to the Democratic National Convention here in Boston. I met a group of 8 of them who came from Houston alone. And other groups as well, the Sikh Coalition with its Every Vote Counts campaign, or the energetic debate in the pages of India Abroad among South Asian Americans. In the middle of September 2004, the Pluralism Project convened a group of national women's organizations to talk about women's issues in the 2004 campaign from the standpoint of women's organizations across the board, from major Jewish, Christian, and Catholic organizations, Protestant Catholic, also to the Muslim Women's League and to the Sikh Coalition. And Sami Moshenberg of the National Council of Jewish Women summed up this day of meeting. It was at the National Press Club in Washington this way. Child care, work-family issues, domestic violence, peace in the Middle East, international family planning, judicial nominations. These are issues that Jewish women care about. But it's striking that these are issues that Sikh women care about, and Muslim and Christian and Buddhist women care about as well. And in one way, the dominant message coming from the 2004 campaign was the clout of evangelical Christians, it may be in many ways that one of the long-lasting points of significance of that campaign was the entry into active voter participation of many religious groups that had not been heard from. Developing advocacy organizations is a third way in which we begin to track the development of public participation, and that includes groups like the Islamic Society of North America that meets a kind of broad-based, almost a family organization that has conferences for 30 and 40,000 people annually on Labor Day weekend. Or the Muslim Public Affairs Council that cites as its mission working for the civil rights of American Muslims, for the integration of Islam into American pluralism, and for a positive, constructive relationship between American Muslims and their representatives. And groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, that has worked primarily as a watchdog organization that in some ways mirrors the kind of work that the Anti-Defamation League does. Or the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund and the Sikh Coalition, both of which have gained force since 9/11 because of the ways in which Sikh Americans had been targeted. They have teams of lawyers that handle court cases. They highlight in some ways the real engagement that is in pluralism, working with the National Transportation Safety Board on airport security, working with the New York City Police Department on issues of wearing a turban in the public service of police, which is one that has occurred across the country. A fourth way of tracking engagement has to do with service. engaging in service beyond your community, and that certainly is an age-old American way of being religious, and the highlighting of news stories from our news service called Religious Diversity News, where we look for things that you don't actually read in the New York Times or the Boston Globe, but that occur in local newspapers across the country. From tsunami relief, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, now the earthquake in South Asia, to begin to watch the ways in which these religious communities are mobilized to work with one another in the social sphere. The Mormons and the Muslims in Salt Lake City getting together in December of last year to get a big jumbo jet full of supplies to go to Aceh in northern Indonesia. Then there are the issues of ceremonial recognition that both have to do with invocations, for example, in Congress, the sorts of things I've cited, invocations in the public sphere as well. And we see those time and again when people speak in their own voice in public space. And now in Ramadan 2005, the word iftar has virtually entered the public lexicon as a way in which we see the public officials from the White House to the Rayburn Building in Washington holding fast-breaking meals and fast-breaking ceremonies for their staffers and for Muslims to invite them to come. And this has happened all across America. So we have this last week the example of the iftar at the White House. And shifting for a moment, and then I'm going to have to just sort of truncate the whole issue of religious and theological pluralism. But iftar has also become that moment when there is a relationship between religious communities. So we have, on Sunday of this immediate past week, the Salam Sukkah, in which the Harvard Islamic Society was asked to break the fast, the Ramadan fast, in the Sukkah at Harvard Hillel. A reciprocal visit, by the way, of the fast breaking in which the Jews were invited to break their Yom Kippur fast with Muslims the week before. This is the sort of thing, amplified hundreds and hundreds of times, that we need to track as we look at the health of a new religious America. Not simply in the civic sphere, which is important, but in the theological sphere, where time and again the questions of theological pluralism, of religious pluralism, of how we, from our own standpoint, whether we're Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus, account for and interpret the religious other. And these are the questions that are on our table. They are extremely important academic and important questions of scholarship. They're also important questions of citizenship, and they're also very important questions of faith. So I'm going to stop here and see where your questions lead you, and be happy to respond to them, either questions or comments. Yes, Martin.
Martin Kaplan. Professor Eck, are there also historical models from which we can learn more in terms of what happened in civic life in empires or countries past that dealt with pluralism successfully?
It's a very difficult question, actually, Martin, because there is a sense in which the most successful multi-religious societies have been totalitarian. That's a problem for us. When we look at ancient Rome, or when we look at, groups called the former Soviet Union, etc., where diversity, cultural religious diversity, has been held in place in relative stability, a lot of those have been with a very, very strong governmental center. And we can think of other examples. But I think the challenge that we have, that Indonesia has, that India has, that Iraq has in its own way, is how to create a multi-religious democracy when you have a strong normative majority. How can we, in a democratic context, successfully develop a pluralistic society in which every religious group feels entitled to its forms of participation within the covenants of citizenship. And that, I think, is the challenge. That, I think, is perhaps the greatest gift that the United States could give to the rest of the world when we're doing lots of things that are not so creative. But this is our workshop. This is our workshop. Yes, sir.
Well, Professor Eck, I don't know if you read a book recently by Russell Shorto called The Island at the Center of the World, which is a story about Manhattan and the Dutch. And the thrust of that book is that Holland and Amsterdam in the 1600s was exactly the kind of society you're talking about, which was extremely democratic and extremely pluralistic and totally accepting. And I believe Holland is the only country in the world that has said never any laws against any religions.
That's been a difficult. I mean, do you have more to say about it? I don't know that.
I have a lot
book.
more to say about it. I don't want to interrupt.
But let me just say, I mean, look at Holland today. I mean, this is the Netherlands has had that kind of openness to, to immigration, to and its involvement with with Indonesia. There's a lot of diversity in tiny Holland, and actually, it's one of the places where people are starting to feel the stress because. Historical examples, yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thanks. Catherine, yes.
Talking about groups like Hamas, where they actually provide a response to resources that their community needs. But I'm interested to talk a little bit about dealing with responding to kind of what I might call sort of the next level of otherness. Groups, for example, like Hamas, who are across the globe. They're not our next door neighbor, but of course through the media, we're kind of playing peekaboo with that. They both are and are not in our living rooms. And how do we kind of get to the next level of being able to kind of parse and respond to that kind of otherness, where it's been very easy to see groups like that in a kind of a sort of monochromatic, demonized way? I wonder if perhaps
that's a tough question because, and these are not impossible questions to study. The question is who's studying them. I mean, we have huge amounts of resources going into certain areas of study in the world, and not so many into exactly this sort of question. How do we actually intelligently think about groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that are that have wings that are very much involved in the things that we would call terrorism, but that may not be perhaps successfully painted with a single brush? How do we also develop forms of dialogue in a society where there are such careful rules about who you can sit down and talk with and who you cannot? And the United States, both politically and United States groups religiously, have had some fairly strong sets of prescriptions against who you can actually sit at the table with. So, you could say there was a sort of almost successful moment when the first Muslim was appointed not simply to some ceremonial post, but to the National Commission on Terrorism when Salam al-Mariyati was nominated to be on that, the only Muslim, the only person from the Middle East, though he lived in Iraq only for a year before he came to the United States as a child. But and then you have, the rallying of many people who simply say, we can't sit with Salam al-Mariyati at the table. As head of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So, and his presence was withdrawn. To me, we need ever more vigorous, ever more critical, ever more engaged forms of dialogue of just this sort, so that we are not continually painting the others, whomever they may be, with a single brush. And you're right about the globalization. I mean, people do, because of the globalization of media and resources, people are able to speak for themselves in ways that give us an opportunity to listen with new ears and to engage. Yes, Rami.
You mentioned interfaith dialogue. My impression has been that interfaith dialogue has been useful for the people doing interfaith dialogue, but has rarely had a public impact. What is your analysis of that process, and does interfaith dialogue actually at some point impact on the civic sphere and the public sphere and these other issues that are so important to people?
It's a very good question, and actually that is part of what we're studying. That, interfaith dialogue in the United States covers a spectrum of things. One example, Worcester, Massachusetts, last year had a series of meetings with a kind of clergy council set of meetings that, sort of the brass model of interfaith dialogue, but where they met from the Archdiocese, the Hindu temple, the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Protestants, the Jews, over the period of a whole year, and drafted what they thought could be a sort of outline for how we might know one another and live together in Worcester. Then the mayor calls a breakfast in which hundreds of people come, and they sit around in the largest ballroom in town around tables of 8 talking about this. And think of ways in which this sort of ethic of relation can be gotten into the schools and talked about in public meetings and broadcast. That's one example. But there are dozens of ways in which interfaith relations take the form of, the Central Ohio Interfaith Council doing Habitat for Humanity together, where they actually do get to know each other, and where the building of bridges of trust within communities, these new sort of instruments of relationship, become extremely important. In the period after 9/11, for example, if one were to do a study of cities and towns that had active interfaith networks, you would begin to see, at least for the most part, ways in which those were able to be leveraged in a time of crisis toward a kind of civic, a civic well-being. This is the sort of work that Asutosh Varshney has done in studying ethnic conflict in India. I think we don't have quite such bad ethnic conflict in the United States, but I think the exploration of what all of this means is very important, and hardly anybody studies it. I think it's worth studying because God knows there are instruments of relationship between bankers and engineers and just about every other aspect of society that far surpass the development of an infrastructure of this sort among religious leaders and communities. Scotty, yeah.
Do you see a proper civic role for exclusivism in the United States? That, as you raised at the beginning, speaking out against other traditions, advocacy organizations, voter registration to try to maintain a Christian nation, invocations in Congress that are exclusivist. How do you as a pluralist deal with that substantial reality in America, and to what extent would you defend the right of exclusivism in America?
Well, I mean, this is the real question. I mean, in the last week, I have met with a whole group of visiting pastors on a study tour from Nashville to here in Boston who wanted to talk about these kinds of issues in their area. I mean, the strength of Christian exclusivism in this country cannot be underestimated, and it makes its way into each and every part of this large map. But it's interesting to note the ways in which the signals that are given. For example, even in the invocation before the Bush I and Bush II inaugurals, there's that same guy from one of those big blockbuster black churches in Dallas, I think it was, who prayed. He had given a fairly exclusivist prayer in 2004, and he had gotten so much critique in public press for that. He probably got a lot of applause as well. This time he gave this really strong prayer, and then at the end he did this kind of twist about, the one that I honor as Jesus, but the God of, everyone, or something of that sort. And you have President Bush talking about the ethical values of America that come from the Sermon on the Mount and Sinai and the Quran. I mean, those little sort of bits of public rhetoric don't go unnoticed, actually. I mean, if you're noticing, we notice. But I think there is somewhere, either maybe it's just a speechwriter somewhere, who thinks that it's important to do this. But you're right that the level of very strong Christian exclusivist language is very pervasive. We kind of misunderestimated, to speak in the language in current these days, but we don't really understand how pervasive it is from the standpoint of Cambridge or maybe from Stanford. I don't know how many more do we have one more question? Yes, sir.
Bill Nitze from Washington. Isn't the problem you allude to with respect to Christianity generic and embedded in all monotheistic traditions? And it's not just exclusivism, it's hierarchy. And it's exclusivism and hierarchy welded to tribal origins and traditions. And in a sense, monotheism, thus construed, is inconsistent with the American civic religion. Our founders were a very unique group of Americans. They were mainly deists, and they had read the classics. They had incorporated the lessons of the European religious wars, and they were inspired by the humanism of the European Enlightenment. They were a lot closer to Spinoza than to certain of the angry preachers of today. And isn't there a fundamental conflict here which isn't going to be dealt with simply by everybody getting along? Don't we have to have a much deeper discussion about the nature of God?
We absolutely do. And you try to show me a theological school, including our own, where that discussion is really at the forefront of theological education. It's almost nowhere. But I think your first point is monotheism inconsistent with, the civic covenant of America? Absolutely not. I mean, actually, the civic covenants of America were argued by more or less monotheists out of theological terms because they felt that the state is not a good, adequate judge of religion. And so, the soul freedom is what Roger Williams called soul freedom. And the gist of so much of Madison's memorial and remonstrance is basically the state should not be involved in this. That actually detracts from the affirmation of the oneness of God and the authority of God. So there were religious reasons that they argued for what you might call a secular state. And it's a good thing they did. When it comes to monotheism in relation to hierarchy, even in the Abrahamic religions, I also think you're not quite on it. Because there is, for example, Tariq Ramadan, one of the great contemporary, you might say, theological thinkers of Islam, basically says the place I begin in my relation to other faiths and people of other faiths is the central Islamic understanding of Tawheed. It is the oneness of God. So I have an obligation to look through the lens of God's oneness at the religiousness of my neighbor. I mean, he says it much more eloquently than that. And, I have my favorite reading list, is hardly any secret, but Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of, Chief Rabbi of Britain, speaking of this issue, says that the challenge for me as a Jew is to recognize God's image in the one who is not in my image. It's not God's image that's a question here. Can we, he says, recognize God in the face of a stranger? Can I hear, as a Jew, the echoes of God's voice in that of a Hindu or Sikh or Christian or Muslim? Can I do so and not feel diminished but enlarged? But there is a lot of hard work to be done, and I think much of it is theological work, not just Christians, not just Jews, not just Muslims. Everyone has got to pitch in on rethinking our religious life in the face of what we know now of one another and of one another's discoveries of the one we call God. Thanks very much. This has been really great pleasure.
Thanks, Diana, for such an interesting session. We're due for a short break right now, and then we'll reconvene for a panel discussion that will be moderated by Professor Harvey Cox and featuring three members of our faculty, Professors Amy Hollywood, Michael Jackson, and Barbara Johansson. And the panel will be called Religion and Government, A Global Perspective. Let's try to keep this break to 10 minutes. We can make up a little bit of time, but that still gives you a chance to take a break. That clock says 20 of, my watch says 26 of. By whatever timepiece you're using, if we can be back in 10 minutes, that would be great. Thanks.